Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I hope that you and your families are staying safe and healthy throughout this crisis. To begin tonight's conversation, I want to take the time to address Ohio's roadmap to economic recovery and what we can do to ensure no one is left behind. Last week, the Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives appointed a special task force to address the economic recovery of our state and what role our legislature can play in making the recovery possible. Speaker House Order was right to initiate the task force as we need to begin preparing now to chart a path back to economic prosperity. Now, however, after no more than a week and a half since his decision, it is clear that the Speaker made a grave mistake in his choice of who would spearhead this effort. In his capacity as the handpicked chairman of the task force, Representative Paul Zellweger has led a team that seems committed to enacting public health and economic malpractice. Members of Zellweger's task force, at the heating of business interests across the state, have pushed to end our governor's stay-at-home order right now and ensure hundreds of thousands of out-of-work Ohioans never receive unemployment benefits. With 389 of our friends, neighbors, and family members lost to this virus statewide and another 5.2 million unemployed Americans, this task force is pursuing policies that would cause both of the numbers to increase. But here's the thing, they're not just numbers. Behind each of them is a loved one loss, a family member suffering from unemployment, a country in mourning. We can't lose sight of that. What we need right now is compassion from our representatives and our leadership in Columbus. We need a plan for how we can ensure no one is left behind in this crisis. And we need leaders who do not deny the science of public health and pandemics. Tonight, we're going to talk through one part of the campaign's plan to address the coronavirus, K-12 education. We cannot afford to abandon an entire generation by failing to provide them the education they deserve and the resources they need. Our teachers are doing all they can to transition classes online for their students, but they need our support. And to break this all down, I am excited to be joined this evening by former teacher Anders Miller. Anders, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Anders. If you just want to give a little bit of a background for yourself, how you originally became an educator and what you're doing right now at Ohio State.
Well, right now I'm a second-year law student at Ohio State University, and before law school, I actually taught high school English for 3 years. I was a licensed teacher, and that was really my dream growing up because there's no better way to give back to your community than to help other people grow into the great people that we know that they can be. So, as I was going through that process, though, of, learning what it means to be an actual teacher, I really realized that there were a lot of issues that were out of my control, that as much as I did everything I could to help my students, we needed more structural changes to be able to get them the services and the education that they have a right to and that they deserve.
Yeah. So you taught. You were a teacher. Where did you teach in the state?
I taught for the whole 3 years. I taught at the same school. So I taught at a high school called Franklin Heights High School. It's in Southwestern City Schools, which is the southwest part of Columbus. It's the second biggest district in Columbus, behind Columbus City Schools, and actually the sixth largest in the state.
Well, I want to thank you for, no matter how short or brief a time it is, it always will mean a lot to, I can only assume it will mean a lot to all the people that you did teach. So thank you for the time that you did put in there. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit, let's frame that conversation a bit about how your background in education, what you're doing now, and some of the work you've done at the State House can lend an insight for what we need to be doing statewide to help our students and our teachers, because we've seen some recent reports that came out yesterday and today from the Cincinnati Enquirer talking about how such a large percentage of our students, we can't necessarily track them down to make sure that they are still attending classes with things being pass-fail. It's difficult to enforce that, making sure that people are getting all of the education that they need and that they have the resources to be able to do online work. So why don't you describe a little bit of the work you've done at the State House and then maybe some of the first steps that we could do to take for at least finishing this school year out. What can we do to help both teachers and students?
Definitely. First and foremost, really what brought me to law school was that experience at the State House. I testified for the first time in 2017 about the resident educator program, which was a really well-intended program. It was about supporting new teachers who we know there are studies that range from 20% to about 50% of new teachers in their first 5 years leave the classroom. And to me, I'm like, what are we doing as a state to help that? And the resident educator program's there, but as I was going through it, really what it was more busy work that actually took time away from the time that I should have been spent looking at student papers, giving feedback, calling parents, but instead I was really busy with paperwork and with explaining and justifying why I was doing what I was doing when in fact I had already done that when I was getting my license to be a teacher. So going through that process, what I noticed was that there were a lot of gaps from the people making decisions where they either weren't in the classroom, didn't talk to people in the classroom, or had been disconnected from the classroom. Mm-hmm. And that struck me as, they should be in conversations, but we need to have teachers in those conversations to make sure that we do know what's happening on the ground so that we can have the best advocates or have the best strategy by having the best advocates in those conversations. So that's really kind of what pulled me in and what brought me to law school. But, it's really just about the kids, because ultimately every person has a right to an education, and we as teachers and as professionals in that field are the ones who know what that means the best on the front line. So connecting people to those opportunities to advocate for their students was really one of the biggest things for me. And I mean, I just wanted to also kind of comment about the thing about me meaning a lot to my students. I'm sure that my students mean so much to me too. Like, I think about them all the time. Like, I remember one of my first students who, you always remember the ones who have your memories are more the ones who initially may give you some trouble. But then they come around because ultimately they're like, oh, you're on my team. Like, you're not one of those people who's going to leave in my life or whatever. And I think of, like, Ruben is his name. And I'm like, I think of Ruben. He was one of the first students I ever taught and ever had that kind of connection with, where we truly built a relationship. And that's what teachers love, and that's what they want to do. And that's why they need to be at the table.
I think we can all list off 2 or 3 names at least of people that you might think of them at the time as having been just solely your AP government teacher or the person who helped you out with a particular club or otherwise, but that they meant so much to you, especially in retrospect. And I don't think they get enough appreciation sometimes for that, because they don't get the opportunity to go back and say thank you as often as they need to.
Yeah.
So you told me before that you stay in touch with a lot of those people you used to work with, that you continue to be involved in some of the, like you said, with the State House efforts, that you're still working to make sure that educators have all of the resources and support that they need. So what have you been hearing from teachers across the state, and from your own personal experience, of what you think we can do right now to help finish out this semester and then start preparing even for next year, if we have to either have a socially distant version of education or if we have to have completely online?
I think that one of the first things is just like we all recognize how awesome. There are very few people who say, teachers are selfish people, because they're not, and they're doing everything that they can to help our kids in this time. But just as everybody else is trying to figure out what's going on around them, teachers are, their students are. So when we're looking at this new time, it's weird. We don't really all know what to do. But as I've been talking to them, House Bill 179 or 197 was just passed, and we know that is a first step. It's by no means going to solve anything. We know that they're okay with no testing this year. We know that distance learning is becoming okay. School lunches, removing some limitations on who can be delivered and who can take them. So those are first steps, but the next steps that we really need to be thinking about, I think, are the vast disparities we have around our schools and our students opportunities. And especially when I think about, I don't want to fully use the terms like rural, urban, and suburban as like we have three kinds of schools, because we don't. We have as many kinds of schools as there are schools in the state, and every school is going to need their own they have their own needs. So I know my students, some of them didn't have internet at home. So, I mean, some of them had unstable home environments in the sense of they were couch surfing or whatever, because, need is high, and especially at this time. So what's going to happen to the differences in growth between students who have a lot of economic resources because of their families and the students who may not have those resources? So how are we going to make sure that through this time of distancing, when, I'm a student, and bluntly, it's difficult to focus because there's so much going on, right? And it's so I empathize with that, and I empathize with the teachers who are, like trying to wrangle students, and also the teachers who are just trying to figure out how to navigate this time themselves, let alone as individuals, let alone as teachers. So looking at that, what is it that we need? Well, I think first we need help from the federal government. We are not seeing that. We need testing, because we can't open our schools if we don't know where these outbreaks are coming and if we don't know who's sick. But specifically for schools, we need that funding that's going to be there for the summer, for kids to have meals, for people to, for all that. But then also, even before the COVID-19 crisis was going on, we had some budget issues and we had some funding issues where local school districts were having money taken away from their public school students going to private schools. A lot of those schools were religious, and we want to have fairness there. It's not that those students who are not going to public school should not have a non-public school option, but if the non-public school option is bankrupting the school, like in the Cleveland Heights University Heights School District, where like a third of their funding is going towards those private schools for students who had never been in the school district, that's a problem, because it's not fair, and they're being judged differently for those performance-based vouchers. Mm-hmm. And addressing that, I think, would be, I would say, a year break between them not using our report, them not taking the test this year, and next year would be a great opportunity for every interested party to figure out what is a better way to address our schools and hold them accountable and measure what's going on, while also not punishing schools who are either not doing well or, due to no fault of their own, are being harmed by the unfair report cards.
Yeah. They're particularly touching on the private versus public funding debate slash discussion that came about when we had this massive potential expansion of Ed Choice vouchers that has been kind of kicked down the road now that we're not entirely sure what may end up occurring based off of the state budget kicking the issue down the road. We don't know how the program exactly would be administered. But particularly in my district, we have a big important levy that's a part of this April 28th now primary that's coming up, that's going to determine whether or not Mason City Schools, which is one of the best school districts in the entire state, public system, is going to be able to continue offering all the different programs and continue its current number of teachers that are employed. And so we continue to see kind of year after year. We had the same thing last year in Lebanon, where there was this massive levy, and it's a question of whether or not we cut busing and massively hike athletic fees, et cetera, to be able to cover all the costs that we can no longer sustain without the new levy. Do you think that now is the time, considering we have to make such large investments in our education system, that we can try to move away from whatever the current system is of having to raise local taxes every few years? Because this seems to be this local issue that the state level could solve if we were to be able to use the funding that we had in the past.
Coming from my law school perspective, there's the DeBrolf cases, which are the cases that pretty much since the late 90s have routinely been deeming Ohio's funding formula as unconstitutional because it is not providing an equitable enough education for all students. Now, I did hear a good counter argument saying, they didn't rule on this specific funding formula, but at the same time, the funding formula is being changed because of those things. So we are still in those discussions. And I mean, at a time like this where everything's being shaken up, it really exposes a lot of the gaps in the safety net and gaps in our gaps that need to be filled for ultimately our kids, because it just really comes down to that. So thinking about Mason, I know that Cleveland Heights, University Heights also had a levy, and people voted on the levy, and they just didn't know that about a quarter of that levy was going to a private school. And private schools in general. So thinking about it from that perspective, about the making sure that people in the community know where this money is going, because when you vote for a levy, you expect it to be for your school, not for the state to take from your school district to then give to a school within your school district that's not a public school and publicly accountable. Because in fact, the private schools did not say that the private schools who are looking for this, a lot of them said, I'm open to some accountability measures, but just not this one. But we want this one to be for public schools, because at the end of the day, it's broken. It's not a good measure of whether a school is able to help a child grow into the productive, the awesome, and complete human beings that we know they can become and that they deserve to become.
I was really proud a couple of years back. I worked on the former state Senate Minority Leader Joe Schiavone's gubernatorial campaign, and I had the privilege of being on the tail end of that. But he always talked about the work that he did. He had one of the State Board of Education members as his lieutenant governor candidate within that race. He always made himself as the education champion, and that kind of example I've tried to follow, and I want to be able to make sure that the state follows this kind of new model. And the fact that we need to address, as you stated, the 4 times in the last 25 years that we've seen that our current funding model is just unconstitutional, doesn't do enough for all the different individual districts across the state that haven't received the proper funding in 25 plus years. We just continue to kick the issue down the road. And so if we're continuing to struggle with local tax levies, and we're continuing to struggle with finding a state education model, and in the fall with the potential to be fully online, do you think we're going to have a wake-up call in the State House, or do you think that there just needs to be federal support? What do you think is the outcome?
I guess I'll take the second part about federal support. I definitely think federal support is important. However, the difficulty with federal support is that they're not the local people who really know what's happening on the ground. So I think that the support needs to be there, and that support needs to be, what do we need? What do you need from us? How can we help you? Instead of, here's what you need. And I think that's the same with the state, thinking about what does the state do? The state is essentially the person that takes the money from all the school districts and then redistributes it based upon a complicated funding formula that, to be frank, I don't even fully understand. And because it's complicated, and I want to recognize, like, there are a lot of people who are trying to make that better, and it is a great opportunity to do that. And getting the federal government to help, that can be helpful, especially with the need for funding. But then thinking about what is it that we need to do to get there, and is what the prediction is. The prediction is that what's gonna happen is, whatever it is that we decide to happen as a group of people in the state, if we determine that our children are enough of a piece of importance for us to make this change, then that's what we have to do. And that's in getting that change for our kids, because ultimately our kids can't vote, and they are relying on us to get them the resources that they need to thrive. And ultimately, I hope the political will is there, and it seems like it is in some ways, and in other ways, though, we want to make sure that it's focused on the children and their right to have an education, and having that as available as possible.
No, I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that our campaign brought up last week, we announced our plan on how we can reform the public employee pension systems statewide. And, that includes pensions for public teachers and for our emergency responders, et cetera. And I wanted to not be able to necessarily get too much into detail of the plan itself. I invite everybody to go read that at our website, morganshown.com. But if you can talk a little bit more about some of the teachers that you knew and some of the problems necessarily with being able to retire within the system, and if you see any particular problems that you've come up with.
That's one of the biggest issues, I think, for newer teachers. They don't know how long they're going to be teaching for. And there are, I believe that the retirement is around 70, or not 70, 37 years, at least in my school district. And that's definitely not going to stay, though. And we are told, that number's there, but that's not going to be the number that you're going to have to rely on. So all my teacher friends, when I was teaching, I saved side money. I knew I could not rely on that pension. And that is something that is worrisome, because ultimately our teachers don't make that much money, in the sense of they are sacrificing a lot of things that they could have done, or because they love teaching kids, and that's what their calling is. And why are we not being able to support them when they retire? That's a difficult question, but I truly believe that making sure that teachers know that, when you retire, you're going to be okay financially, I think that's a super important thing. And I know would give a lot of people peace of mind, and also bring more people into the profession who are, I would be a teacher, but the conditions are too rough. Like I said, 20 to 50% of teachers leave after their first 5 years. And we know that the number one thing and the number one reason why is because they lack support. So getting people that support is so essential. And like I said, Ohio tried, but ultimately that support was actually burdensome, not supportive.
And they've done right by us, and we have to do right by them at the end of the day. It can't be a one-way street where we have continually people dropping out at the rates that we see, that there's this kind of burnout rate that we discussed before the call. So I want to be able to give you one last final opportunity. If you have anything else you want to be able to talk about, to bring up with, whether it's test scores or how we prepare for the fall, or what we can do right now before we wrap up.
Yeah, I want to thank all my teachers. When you were talking about I thought of many people to begin with, but I'll think of my teacher. I went to Sycamore High School, which is right next to Mason, and I think about my teacher, Greg Cole, Mr. Cole. I had him in 8th grade as a lacrosse coach. I had him 7th and 8th grade as a lacrosse coach. Then he moved to high school with me. I felt like he was following me, but in a good way. He was my coach there. So I just want to say thank you to all of them, and anyone who's a teacher. Thank you for doing the job that I know I couldn't keep doing, and as hard as that is. And it was hard to leave the classroom, but I'm excited to be able to continue helping kids through my legal education.
I'll take the opportunity to do the same. Terry Harris and Frank Back and Paul Hogan all were super important people to me in high school. So if you're watching, thank you so much for everything that you've done to get me here. So thank you, Andrew, so much for taking the time this evening. I know it meant a lot to me, and I hope everybody was able to learn something new about what we can do going forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much.